Dames en heren, mesdames et messieurs, ladies and gentlemen, before I officially welcome you, a housekeeping message. Please switch off your mobile phones, also in view of the recording. So, ladies and gentlemen, after an interruption of 2 years, for reasons that I do not need to mention, it's a great pleasure to welcome you here in Ghent in the name of the Department of History and the Faculty of Arts and Philosophy to the second Varoujan lecture in the buildings of Ghent University. And this building, it's called the Rosier, was finished in 1890, which is 15 years before Varoujan arrived here as a student to study political science, a degree he obtained in 1909. Now, Varoujan probably didn't get any lectures in this building because the building was destined for the natural sciences, and as you see, it's still used for classes of architecture and engineering, but of course he would have known the building. The years Varoujan spent in Ghent were formative, if not always happy ones. He suffered from a lack of money, and although there were quite a few foreign students in Ghent at the time, he looked and felt like an outsider. And an unhappy love affair did not help either. That may be a staple of any student career. On the other hand, he used the occasion of being in Ghent to dive into Western European literature, including the classics, for he had to sit an exam of Latin in order to enter the university. And he was influenced by the then world-famous and now slightly forgotten Nobel Prize winner Maurice Maeterlinck on the French pronunciation. In Ghent, he also participated in meetings of the liberal students who at that time gathered also people with socialist ideas, and he even published a couple of poems of his in French in a student publication. And all of this fed into the poems that he wrote in Ghent and later when he returned to Constantinople to work as a teacher until 1915, the year of his tragic death. Now, much of this you may already know, but you can read this and many more about the Ghent years of Varoujan in the special issue of the Revue Belge de Philologie et d'Histoire of 2019, which we put together with a group of Belgian and international scholars. Without, of course, we focus on the Ghent years of Varoujan, without, of course, wishing to deny that he was influenced in manifold ways by other factors, and that made him into such an important figure in Armenian literature. For those of you who might be interested in this volume, it's in French. It's available through open access, and I will pass on to Grigor the link of where you can find the volume. The initiative for the Varoujan lecture, however, did not originate with us, Ghent University, but was an idea of Grigor Moscovian and the program of Armenian Studies, and we are very happy to collaborate with them to make this possible, and to be honest, they did all the work. And as usual, the one who speaks first at events like this has done the least. So I wish expressly to thank Grigor and his team for all the work they put into this, as well as the Arslanian Foundation and the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation for their financial support. They are represented here by Mr. Panossian and Mr. Arslanian. The first Varoujan lecture 2 years ago was by Grigor Beledian and focused on the poetics of Varoujan himself, and you can read some of the ideas he put there in his contribution to this volume. Yet the idea of the lecture is also to broaden our insights in Armenian literature and its historical context in general, and bringing this to an interested audience. And that's why tonight's lecture will be about an elder contemporary of Varoujan, Eghia Demirjibashian. And the speaker is no one less than Theo van Lint, Calouste Gulbenkian Professor of Armenian Studies at Oxford University and one of the leading scholars of Armenian literature. He specializes, or I know him especially from his work on medieval Armenian literature, both prose and poetry. He is, for example, working at the moment on a translation of the letters of Grigor Magistos Palavuni of the 11th century, which promises to be important not just for Armenologists, but also for those interested in the wider literature and history of the region. As a sometime Byzantinist, one of those. He's also a keen divulger of his knowledge to a broader audience. Witness his translation or partial translation of poems of Gregory of Narek into Dutch, and I just learned that he has also translated some poems of Varoujan into Dutch. Yet he ranges, as this point already indicates, he ranges much more widely than medieval literature and has a profound knowledge of the subsequent periods of Armenian literature, including the modern period, the topic of tonight's lecture. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Theo here, and we are very much looking forward to his lecture. First, however, I wish to give the floor to Grigor Moscovian, the heart and soul of the program for Armenian Studies, and the Varoujan lecturer, who will welcome you in the name of the program. Please.
Taniel Varouzhan տարեկան տասախոսության մեր առաջին հիմնադիրցերն արգեն 2019-ի հանդիպումին հաջորդող բարդատիր թաթարեն հետ մեր կյանքի մեջ շատ բան փոխվեցավ։ Թուրքանալով մարդահրավերներով լեցուն ժամանակաշրջանիմը։ Ամփոփողը մեր օրե-օր ուրջացող աշխատելու երանգն է։ Ահավասիկ արդյունքը Բոլորիս մեկտեղումը, որուն համար երախտաբար դեմ շատերու։ Նախ իմ սրդակին շնորհակալությունս այսօրվա տասախոսին պրոֆեսոր Theo Van Lintին, որ սիրահոժար կերպով ընդառաջեց մեր հրավերը։ Շնորհակալական երկրորդ խոսքս գուղեմ այս սերնարգի համագազմագերբիչ հաստատության Ghent համալսարանին այս երթիկը դրամատրելու համար։ Շնորհակալություն իմ համագործակիցիս պրոֆեսոր Peter Van Nuffelen-ին իր կորզնական նեցուգին համար։ Սրդակին շնորհակալություններս անքին ընկերներուս Մովսես Տեր-Քևորքյանին և Շողեր Մարգոսյանին։ Ինչպես նաև բաշտունակիցներուս Աթամ Սմարտին, Ռաֆայել Գրեգորյանին և Գարո Քյուրքյունյանին, իրենց նեցուգին և գազմագերբչական աշխատանքներում բերած մասնակցության համար։ Մեր հատուկ շնորհակալությունը այս սերնարգին հովանավորներուն, Calouste Gulbenkian և Arslanyan հիմնարկություններում։ Այս սերնարգին վերսկսումը գզուկատիպի կարևոր անգյունաթարցիմը։ Այս տարի մեր հաստատությունը իր հիմնադրումի առաջին տասնամյակը կփոլորե։ Դժվար, բայց արկասավոր ուղիմն էր մեր անցած ճանապարհը։ Արդյունքը դեսլագանի և ադորմով հաղգված ծրագիրիմը։ Հաջորդող տասնամյակները միայն մեր անտուլ աշխատանքով կրնան ըլլալ աննախընթաց ծաղկումի շրջանը։ Աբակային մեր սևերումի գիզագետը պիտի դարձնենք արևմտահայագիտությունը իր բոլոր բնակավարներով։ Այս ուղղությունը և գործունեության փոխանցակությունը արդացոլող աշխատանքը նոր ինքնությամբ պետք է հստակորեն արտահայտվի։ Առայդ, այսօր պաշտոնապես կհայտարարեմ մեր հաստատության անվանափոխության մասին։ Այսուհետև հայագիտական ուսման ծրագրի փոխարեն մեր հաստատությունը պիտի կոչվի արևմտահայագիտական ուսման կենտրոն Center for Western Armenian Studies։ Մեր գործունեության առաջին տասնամյակը վկայությունն է արևմտահայերենի և արևմտահայ մշակույթի նկատմամբ մեր ունեցած հանձնառության Այն մշակույթն է, որուն կենսավայրին արկասիկներն են Eghia Demirjibashian եւ Taniel Varouzhանը։ Արեմդահայագիտությունը մեր առաքելության աբական է։ Շնորհակալություն։
Thank you all for coming, and for those who are not here but are also here, thank you for watching. I would like, in my turn, like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this lecture, to give this lecture on a subject, not only Eghia Demirjibashian, but on Western Armenian literature and on Armenian literature in general, which is not widely enough known to everyone who loves literature, to everyone who loves to know about other peoples, most of the time other peoples, although I think the majority of people present here would say it's our people, the Armenian people. And therefore I warmly welcome this opportunity to speak about someone who, even in Armenian circles, is not as widely known as he might have been. I also would like to extend my congratulations to Krikor Moskovyan for this wonderful next step of the foundation of the Center of Western Armenian Studies, and to thank him for his really, how can one say it, indefatigable work that he's been doing to make this possible. Congratulations to you and to those who work with you, Adam as well, and others. And I would like to thank Professor Peter van Nuffelen for his contribution to Varoujan studies, which probably was not something he thought of when he defended his doctorate, and but which nevertheless is an important contribution, as not only as an opening to the years that Taniel Varouzhan spent in Ghent, but also to the wider study of the poet and his place in European and in world literature, not to say in Armenian literature. Then now to Eghia Demirjibashian, writing between hope and tragedy, his life and work. Eghia Demirjibashian was born on the 8th of May 1851 in Gasköy, in Armenian Gaskyur, in Constantinople, and died in Pera, another part of the city, on the 19th of July 1908 by committing suicide. In between lies a life of 57 years dedicated to the emancipation of the Armenians by means of education, and in particular to Armenian literature. Eghia Demirjibashian was a philosopher, a poet, a prose writer and critic, who contributed profusely to the blossoming field of Armenian journals and was the founder of several of them. He was actively engaged in many of the burning issues of his time. One of these was the education of the Armenians, in particular that of girls and young women. Another was the struggle for the determination which language would have to be the vehicle of expression among the Armenians. Krapar, the classical language that had functioned much in the way Latin had done in the Middle Ages in Europe, namely as a means of mutual understanding for people with different languages, or the vernacular, the Ashkarapar, which had many different manifestations in its various dialects, but which had the advantage of being a living language. Further, there were the social issues of the day, the growing distance between, on the one hand, the poorer Armenians of the capital, some of whom were born there, while many more formed part of the streams of wretched young men that kept pouring in from the provinces looking for work, the so-called pantucht, and on the other hand, the rich amiras, who were often close to the most powerful elements in the church and in the empire, the church which effectively ruled the Armenian population under the millet system. Further, a beginning secularization could be detected, which meant that the church was gradually beginning to lose its almost absolute hold over the population. Finally, over the Armenian population. Finally, and this is by no means an exhaustive list of debated issues, there were the two most important other Christian denominations that had gained a hold over the Armenians, albeit to a far lesser degree than the Armenian Apostolic Church still had, namely the Armenian Catholics and the Armenian Protestants. Their emergence among the Armenians had been the subject of fierce communal strife. We will touch on elements of most of these problems in the course of this brief narrative of Yerea's life and work. Eghia Demirjibashian, which in translation means Elijah from the family of the head of the ironsmiths, of the ironmongers, traced his origins back to Georgia. In the 18th century, his ancestor Gevorg, a master smith, had been brought to Constantinople as a prisoner of war. He was not killed, but was sent to work as a master in the royal shipyards, because of his professional skills. After 2 years, he was awarded an elevated title and worked with 4,000 persons under his command. His son, Calouste occupied the position of Demirjibashi, head of the smiths. Calouste had 13 children. Yerea, as he would affectionately be called in Constantinople, was born into the family of one of Calouste's children, Garabet Ara, a craftsman and the daughter of a priest from Beşiktaş, yet another part of the capital of the Ottoman Empire, where the Demirjibashians had their estate. Yerea received his primary education in the Ohanes Batveli school, Batveli I should say in good Western Armenian, followed by the Nersesyan school in Khazköy, which was the best Armenian school of the time in the capital. In 1866, he changed to the Shahnazarian school, which was newly established by Nubar Pasha, the Armenians' top-ranking official in the Ottoman government. It brought along the dissolution of the Nersesyan school and the wholesale transfer of its higher classes, to the Shahnazarian school. In this new school, the reticent, serious, and avidly reading Yerea, himself still a pupil, worked as assistant teacher for the younger classes. Depending on which secondary literature one reads, this is sometimes seen as a deplorable change of institution, because it separated him from a teacher who could watch over the extraordinary young pupil's choice of reading, the romantic poet Thomas Terzian. This man, Yerea's senior by only a decade, had himself been a pupil of the great Armenologist, poet, and Mekhitarist father, Revont Alishan. Another sign of the Mekhitarist schooling, bringing along a very solid command of classical Armenian, was Matatya Karagashian, who also taught Demirjibashian. In class, imagine, he was sitting next to Minas Cheras, with whom he would maintain a friendship throughout his life. Cheras was to become an influential teacher himself and a political figure, and formed part of the Armenian delegation that took part in the Congress of Berlin in 1878, serving as interpreter and secretary. Another of the classmates was Reteos Berberian, who would become a celebrated educator and poet, and who founded his own school in 1876, the famous Berberian School, which was, in Gevorg Bardakyan's words, destined to become a prestigious institution where generations of Armenians and a host of prominent Armenian intellectuals were educated. I mention these companions of the young Yerea not so much because of their subsequent fame and fate, but because they played a role in Yerea's life and work. Several letters to Minas Cheras have survived, and Berberian's name and deeds occur often in his work. In the brief and useful History of Armenian Literature, published by Father Chanashian, a member of the Catholic Armenian Brotherhoods of the Mechitarists from Venice, whom I have mentioned several times already, the influence of early reading is not underestimated. Father Chanashian's assessment of the consequences of the change of school sum up in a nutshell part of the problems Yerea's stance in religious and intellectual life was going to cause him. Because Father Chanashian writes, he read such books, novels and works of philosophy, as were detrimental to his intellectual formation. From the age of a young man on his mind's aspirations towards liberalism can be felt. The essay which he presented at the end of the school year, entitled A Modest Investigation of the Conscience of Someone like Shahnazarian, already shows his foolish nature. These somewhat harsh words stem from a book published in 1973, not 1873. It gives one an idea about the attitude that many teachers would have had towards Yerea's choice of books more than a century before. Still, the fact that Yerea, as other children of his age, was very impressionable is underlined by Minas Tiras's statement that among the dangerous novels they read, which were all stories about love, one would say, of course, by far the most influential was Goethe's Die Leiden des jungen Werthers, The Suffering of the Young Werther. We have Yerea's own witness about his early reading, which betrays a great variety of works from French and German literature. He mentions La Nouvelle Héloïse, Obermann, Corinne, Gavour, René, Raphaël, Werther, Indiana, Lelea, and the Revue des Deux Mondes. Upon finishing his secondary education, we are now in 1869, he started to work for the Ottoman government in the Department of Publications, where he had access to all periodicals. He then transferred to the Ministry of Public Works, where he became secretary to the leading committee. He considered this a waste of time. What is this with committees and finding them a waste of time? It's not of today. Since his real wish was to receive a higher education and to dedicate himself completely to literature. In 1874, we may detect the purportedly negative influence of novels such as Goethe's Werther, although one cannot be sure what truly prompts an attempt at suicide. Yerea had fallen in love with a girl who herself had decided to marry a rich official. That also is nothing new. Yerea was deeply disappointed, and in despair he threw himself from the cliff at Moda in Constantinople. When he landed in the water, this was so very cold that he came out of it and took refuge in the young woman's house, where her mother brought Yerea back to life. However, the girl did not change her mind. In his memoirs, published in 1929 in Paris, Minas Tiras's has some very sharp and unkind words to say about this girl. She is still alive and has become an ugly and paralytic old woman. If Yerea would see her today, he would have been convinced that it was silly to commit suicide for such a creature. Now came his chance to visit Europe, where he wanted to go in the pursuit of further education. In order to restore his deteriorated health, his doctors advised him to leave Bolis, as Armenians call Constantinople. He went to Marseille, where he did not lead the quiet life his doctors had in mind. He was supposed to study at the Advanced School for Trade, but instead founded a weekly, not for the first time, or the last, entitled Le Moniteur littéraire et financier de Marseille. His aim was to acquaint the West with that sorrowful people, the Armenians. Only a few issues saw the light of day. 2 years later, he returned to Constantinople, where he started to work as a translator from French into Turkish for the Ministry of Education. He left his job in December 1877, when he began to emit blood for the first time. By this time, he had adopted the ideas of Minas Tiras, who had proposed a solution for the language problem by adopting a so-called Untragan Karaganukun, a selected grammar, which met with fierce opposition in Armenian society, even to such an extent that newspapers and journals would no longer publish articles written by either Tiras or by Yerea. However, Yerea distanced himself from his friend's ideas in this matter, the language problem, and found himself publishing in a range of Armenian periodicals. He adopted the pen name Kraser Adom and published in Massis and Terjemen Efkiar, exposition or interpretation of ideas. His work was well liked, and he began to make a name as a critic. In 1880, he was elected a delegate for the neighborhoods of Stenya and Yenikö, but resigned from this after a brief period only, and this was by no means unusual, it seems. More people resigned very quickly. In 1882, he accepted a position as teacher in Pera in the Armenian Pedagogical Institute, Haikagan Gurtaran. Alongside this and his activities as a contributing writer to several periodicals, he had plans to begin one of his own. This came about in 1883 when he founded the Kragan Yev Imastasirakan Shajun, literary and philosophical movement or motion, to which he was the sole contributor. So he was a man of many talents and had to write a lot. Funding was made available by a certain Yesayan. A year later, he became editor-in-chief of the monthly Yer Krakund, the Globe, which occupied him more than full time. For 7 months in 1886 and 87, he was the editor of the monthly Denbes, The Economist, the journal of the Union for Oriental Economic Sciences, but had to give this up because the Krakanyev Imasta Siragan Sharjum had problems and had to be published on a bi-monthly basis until it stopped appearing altogether in April 1888. And later that year, in November, the same fate befell Yerkrakund. So we see that he often has problems to keep journals going. He has to contribute to them himself. He has to find funding for them, and that shows something about part of his isolated situation, even though he was well liked as a phenomenon. From 1888, he worked in the Ghent Varoujan, the Central Institute teaching philosophy, Institute for Education, teaching philosophy and history of philosophy, pedagogy and aesthetics. He also contributed to the well-known periodical Hayrenik, the Fatherland, with articles of a critical nature about the role of the church in Armenian society, such as Yegeretsin Amenuse, the church belongs to all of us, and Benchu Jam Chenkiertar, why do we not go to church? From a literary point of view, the period between 1883 and 1889 would prove to be the most fruitful of Yeria's life, from between his 32nd and his 38th year. But then life once more began to show its darker sides to Yeria. In his family, death struck. His younger brother Boros died, then his father, followed shortly after by his mother. They all died from the same cause, tuberculosis, an illness that ran in the family. We have seen that early signs of it had manifested themselves in Yeria already well before this happened. He became extremely lonely, having no one to live with. He frequently changed houses, practically going from house to house, motivated by an onset of paranoia, a state of mental illness that would assail him more than once during the remainder of his life. You may by now be wondering, why is this guy worth so much attention? I hope we'll come to that. In 1893, he moved from Kadıköy to Hasköy, where he had a house for himself. It was filled with books everywhere, and shelves on tables and chairs, and apart from that, a painting of his grandfather, the priest from Beşiktaş, and 2 clocks, neither of which worked. On the armchair the Bible rested, opened at the book of Job. In 1891, he had begun to contribute to Tzarik, flower, writing on all matter of subjects and in varying ways. In 1895, on a winter evening, after he had been looking for a house all day, with the city and Yeria both covered in snow, he knocked on a door in Pera without knowing who lived there. The door was answered by a lady of small stature with blue eyes and blonde hair. Another story tells that he had decided to ask to stay in a mosque and that he met her first there. Her name was Ellen Nissen, and she was Hungarian. She became what Yeria called his guardian angel. He took a room in her house where she looked after him. Thus he lived for 2 years, until sometime during 1897, he took off without a warning and disappeared. After a few months, he came back to live in Ellen Nissen's house again. It transpired that he had gone to Europe, visiting Geneva, Vienna, and Budapest. Back in Bolis, he started to contribute to the periodical Byzantion, using the pseudonym Kraser Adom. Not much later, 1901, he showed signs of mental illness and was taken to the Armenian hospital in the city, where he stayed for a year in the room where the much-beloved Bishop Karikin Servantians had stayed. Some of you will know him. Servantians had done much to describe the Armenians' folklore and further culture in the provinces of the Ottoman Empire, including historic Armenia. While in recovery in hospital, Yeria was well enough to do some work and started to write for Massis, that's the other name for the Mount Ararat, the periodical run by the well-known author and literary activist and contemporary of Yeria, Arpiaryan. Here he published this article, Hivandei Yekik Desixis, I was ill, you came to see me, dedicated to Ellen Nissen. Finally he got out. It's quite a, let us say, a saccharine piece. It's beautifully set up, but rather sentimental. There's a lot of tears flowing and a lot of handkerchiefs being handed out by Ellen Nissen to the poor Yeria. Finally he got out. He suffered from paranoia once more. He saw shadows around him and imagined that they persecuted him. 3 years later, in 1904, he wrote a request to the Armenian Patriarchate, so to the head of the Armenian community in the Ottoman Empire, asking to be taken into hospital again. And here, which was granted, and here he was continuously visited by Hrant Nazarians. This author wrote a piece entitled Inchgene Yerevan, What is Yerevan up to? What's he doing? Which was published in 1908 in the journal Louis, which means light. The description he gives of Yerevan in his sickbed is interesting for its emotional, perhaps even sentimental intensity. And it goes as follows. In the depths of the sheets of a bed, he wrote, forlorn, with his wide forehead reminding one of Verlaine, but the head of a good angel, for whom still the eyes remain, in order to shed tears. They are scattered and practically lost and become holes in the depth of pedals, nail themselves onto a corner of the room, fixed on a point where his delirious imagination thinks it can make out a shadow which frightens him with its cruel appearance. It is my mother who curses me. My boy, you became a writer, you will die of hunger. He left the hospital in order to go back to the only person who understood him and who looked after him, the Hungarian lady Ellen Nissen. Still, the last years of his life were empty, an image of loneliness and, to a certain extent, of pointlessness. On the evening of Sunday, the 6th of July, according to the old calendar, making use of the temporary absence of Ellen Nissen, he hung himself with the belt of his trousers from the light over the door of his room, from the window. His guardian angel kept the belt and left his room as it was until she herself died in 1919, so 11 years later. The Armenian Church looks upon suicide as one of the gravest of sins, the taking of one's life given by God. Nevertheless, the Armenian Patriarch, the highly respected Malachia Ormanyan, ordered all the ranks of the hierarchy involved, from his lieutenant, so his second in place, until the parish priest of Pera, to organize the funeral. On Tuesday afternoon, Yerevan's remains were brought to the Church of the Holy Trinity. A magnificent funeral service was held in the church, of which the choir and the altar are impressively decorated, with Yerevan's bodily remains placed on the elevation that separates the area for the choir and the clerical dignitaries from that of the celebrating priests. He was laid out in a coffin made of walnut, decked out with 3 wreaths made of roses. The funeral oration was pronounced by Bishop Ter Humayek, who, in a fine gesture combining religion and deep veneration for the Armenian language, takes a line from Grigor Narekatsi's Book of Lamentation as his guiding thought. Handartetso paitivet kenats estsovuis merik, assuage with the life-giving wood of your cross the tribulations of this my sea. Fellow writers carried the coffin out of the church into the courtyard, accompanied by big candles held up by other figures from Constantinople literary life. In the courtyard, a poem was read, aptly entitled Lament. 2 funeral orations were pronounced, one by Theotik, the well-known editor of the yearly almanac that goes by this name, the other by Dikran Cherakyan, who was better known as the poet Indra. Then the coffin was taken to the graveyard in Shishli, accompanied by an immense crowd. Here Yerevan was buried under the wall set apart for those who had committed suicide, far away from the graves as Christian customs required. Later, Minas Tirith mediated with Patriarch Yerishe Durian, who gave permission for his remains to be placed in a proper grave within the churchyard. Of course, these few traces do not begin to sketch the life and work of a prolific writer and philosopher, a man living in an age that saw a worldview based on scholarship take part of the place reserved for interpretations of reality based on religion. As a philosopher, Yerevan was a positivist, while his poetry reveals a complex emotional world. He was much loved, and at times no doubt controversial public figure, at the same time one of the most withdrawn men imaginable. In death, he found grace with the church with which he had often taken issue. The extremes that provide some of the seeming contradictions in Yerevan's life can be observed in his work as well, where alongside less than felicitous pieces stand some of the finest shorter works written in modern Armenian, and some very good poetry. I will not go into the philosophical aspects of Yerevan's works, although it is important to come to an understanding of the complexities of his outlook and to assess his place in the development of Armenian thought. An excellent assessment of Yerevan's thought is given in Grigor Beledjan's essay about him in his book Mart Battle, published in Antelias in 1996. Yerevan's work is not yet available in a compact set of volumes that could be called collected works, and we are still very far away from a complete definite edition of his legacy. Much remains scattered in periodicals. What we do have is the following. After the Second World War, 2 volumes containing selections of his poetry, short stories, critical essays, and letters have appeared. The first one was published in 1955 in Paris under the title Artsak Echer Namakner Kertwalsner, this book. It appeared as volume 18 in the series Hai Kraket Neru Parigamner, Friends of Armenian Writers, which had begun to appear in 1930. No compiler is mentioned, nor is the author of the introduction, from which many of the biographical details I've just shared with you were taken. The volume is described as a bibliographic rarity in the second collection, dedicated to Yerevan's work, published by Sovietakan Gro, the Soviet writer, the publishing house in Yerevan, in 1986, under the redaction of Stepan Topchan. In the early 2000s, I was able to procure the copy you've just seen of the 1955 collection in the Abril bookshop in Glendale, the half-Armenian town that is part of Los Angeles, where a whole pile of them was available at the time. The 2 editions I just talked about overlap, but the 1986 Yerevan edition contains several short stories that are absent from the 1955 edition. The Yerevan edition gives an introduction, but lacks a commentary or notes to the pieces collected. Still, their combined contents represent only a tiny part of Yerevan's output. 2 further collections, more restricted in character, yet valuable, also saw the light since Yerevan's death. Already in 1910, Hrant Nazarians published the love letters of Eghia Demirjibashian. It's a book I have not seen nor read. More than a century later, in 2015, the Yerevan publishing house Sarkis Gatchens, in its series Ars Poetica, brought out Angeren Yerk, Banastertsutuner, Song of the Vulture, poems, edited with commentary by Siranush de Varoujan. This is a step forward in several respects. It practically doubles the amount of the poems contained in the earlier 2 editions, from 60 to 120 or so. It also contains the prose works under the name prose poems, which is certainly justified in many cases. The choice of text and its source is given in separate sections of notes, where also further commentary is at times given. And the volume seeks to maintain the organizing principles that guided Demirjibashian's publication of his own poems in Tararans. That is the name for a gathering of poetry dating back to the Middle Ages, indicating a collection for use in church, as well as that of the so-called Tarasatsner, poets active between the 12th and 18th century, whose themes may be secular or religious. Demirjibashian had planned at least 2 of such collections, or perhaps one would say series, entitled Tararam. They appeared from 1884 in Krakanyev Imastasirakan Sharjum, one of the periodicals of which he himself was the editor. He did not sign them, but since that editorial was filled with work he signed with his own name, or with one of his many pseudonyms, Kraser Atom, Dvoyan assumes that they were to be recognized as their authors, these 2 pseudonyms, the pseudonym and his own name. The second series under the title Tararan contained only 2 poems, and he did not continue the format. This book, Angeren Yerk, opens with the text Inche Banastertsutyune, what is poetry, which was the introductory text to the second curtailed Tararan. It was published in 1899 in Massis under the pen name Hur Hayrian. We haven't seen this one yet. Hur means fire, Hai is Armenian, Higher Father, and the Yan ending is emblematic for Armenian names, as you know. It formed the introduction to the second Tararan, the aborted one. In the piece, Demirjibashian, or better, Hur Hayrian, offers a historical survey of the development of poetry, which he sees dying, at least in France, with André Chénier, only to be resurrected with Goethe, not much after. He goes on to make a distinction between what he calls impersonal, an-ans, and personal, ans-nakan poetry. The highest achievement of the former, where genius creates a world where everything hangs together perfectly, is seen in Goethe, Demirjibashian affirms. One might have witnessed it also in Shelley, he says, had he lived longer. Personal poetry is represented by Byron, the man of the age. He elaborates on Armenian poetry of his own time, noting the firm establishment of the vernacular modern Western Armenian as a vehicle of poetic language in which personal poetry can be expressed. That's a victory for his points of view. He finishes with a reference to his own poetry, much of which is circulating in unpublished form. His final comments concern his predilection for everything dark, shady, somber, caught in the word mood. This has always been his greatest inspiration, he says. He has decided on a title for the collection of his sad poems, Herarik Mutin, Heat or Ardor of the Dark, and says, "Oh yes, I love the dark with ardor, and with the shrieks of my soul I describe them on paper." Eghia began to publish at a very young age. He was 17 or 16, still at school. His final thesis, mentioned above, was published in 1870. I will not give here a full catalogue of the works he published outside of the periodical press, which was not always welcoming his work, but will mention the following. He edited a selection of Minas Tiras's funeral orations. How is that not surprising as a genre? Written in his special version of modern spoken Armenian, Untro Rakan Ashkarapar, so the variety of Western Armenian that did not make it, but which Minas Tiras had devised. A defense by Eghia of this type of Ashkarapar was published a year later, and was the last work to be published in this version of modern Armenian. It is entitled Norkiank, New Life, Volume 1, Language of the People. The same year he published the volume Bizak, I should say, was also the name by which one of the most famous medieval manuscript illuminators is known, Sarkis Bizak from Cilicia, under the pseudonym Gaituni, which means the stinger. It is written in common Ashkarapar. Also in 1879, his philosophical dictionary is published, and this is not a regular explanatory dictionary, but an explanation of several key concepts and ideas Eghia considered central. He uses another of his many pseudonyms, giving Azata Khoyan as the author's name. This, of course, means the freethinker. In 1880, the philosophical dictionary is reissued, containing rebuttals of criticisms leveled at its first edition. One can really say that the critical climate between publishing authors and critics was very lively in these years. This is followed by an open letter to the Patriarch Nerses concerning education, one of the key issues in Armenian life in Egheia's opinion. He signs it once more as Azata Khoyan. Then a year later, a selection of his works appears in a separate volume. Then follows the period in which he was editor of several periodicals, and the publication of several volumes of his own work ceases until 1890, when his discourse on the education of girls sees the light. Most famous, perhaps, were his French-Armenian and Armenian-French dictionaries, which went through several reprints and were used well beyond the Second World War. We have now come across a variety of Egheia's pseudonyms or pen names. There are many more, which we haven't heard yet. Melania, Nurania, so female names, Stevanio, Chuknavor, Chin Hakob, Haituni, Monazan, Sharjans, and others still. What do those signify? The multitude of them does not suggest a simple act of concealment of the author as a person of flesh and blood. As far as I know, there has been no systematic study that compares the type of texts underwritten by a particular pen name with other texts signed by another one. This might yield some insight, though, in how they are used, what they represent. Kriko Beledjan, who has broached the problem, is wary of the possibilities of such an enterprise. I wonder, are we in the presence of a phenomenon we know from Fernando Pessoa, who created 4 different authors, writing in different styles with complete biographies of their own, sometimes offering criticism of one of the others as unconnected entities? Beledjan mentions Pessoa in his pioneering study on Eghia and his work, and elaborates masterfully on his reflections on Egheia's eye his yes in Armenian, starting with his use of the term hivandutun, illness, which perhaps more than another puts its stamp on Yerevan's life and work. He devotes a section to the pen names under the title, The Abstract Theatre of Pseudonyms. Is this myriad of names an indication of a deranged mind? Does one require a truly interdisciplinary study of the different voices and personalities coming to the fore in Yerevan's work, which will include also the pieces that are not signed, because there are many of those as well? Does the scholar carrying out such research need to have an understanding of schizophrenia and be aware of the research currently being undertaken in medical humanities, as it's called, where study of trauma and madness is attracting much attention? Varoujan suggests not. Referring to a famous example, he wonders, what if these names are deployed to bring method to the madness? Quoting Hamlet. They may be an answer to the inner turmoil, not an expression of it. He may well be right. Still, Yerevan's strategy of self-medication through the deployment of pen names might still be of interest to students of medical humanities and students of literature, pur sang, so to say. It may be useful for scholars to take a step back and start with the basic work, still in its infancy, of gathering all of Yerevan's work. This might be a first step in getting to know it better. Yerevan himself believed strongly in the usefulness, the efficacy of the dispersion of his literary and publicistic work in the various journals of his time. However, we do not have subscriptions to them ourselves that have them land on our doormat or inbox every day, once a week, on a monthly basis. Yerevan's dispersion was not one of publishing in order not to be visible. No, quite the contrary. He believed he could make a contribution and wanted to do so, as desperate and sad he might be himself, often. In order better to assess what this consisted in, a critical edition of his complete works would be a desideratum. It will provide the basis for further studies, such as those into his pen names, for which Varoujan's insights are fundamental. It would require a very good postdoc to do that, but I think it is a very interesting project that might help us getting better acquainted with what Yerevan was up to. As things currently stand, it is impossible to give a balanced survey of the whole of Yerevan's work. I would therefore like to finish by concentrating on one of his shorter pieces, which conveys, I think, the extraordinary strength of the best of his lyrical prose, and gives us an insight into his perception of Constantinople, with its complex connotations with nature as well as with culture. It also gives a glimpse of the joy, despite or contemporary with melancholy that is at times also present in his works. In fact, in many a piece he writes with a great sense of humor, which has probably not come through in this presentation so far. And in this piece, which I'm going to read to you, we have a leitmotif in the recurring line of Goethe's famous poem Mignon. Kennst du das Land wo die Zitronen blühen? Do you know the land where the lemons grow, lemons blossom, which forms part of his Wilhelm Meister's Lehrjahre, so the educational years of Wilhelm Meister. And the piece is called Mer Bosphore, Our Bosporus, and I give a translation of it here. On the vault of heaven, in the boundless space of heaven, two suns will never be separated from each other by such a beautifully blue and beautifully shaped partition as those two worlds glorified by the sun, Europe and Asia, which are separated by the Bosporus. There, my sweetheart, there it is that I want you to take me, did I exclaim far away from the shores of the Bosporus. Twice did I go away from my paradisiacal birthplace. I would turn my face to the east with the fluid glance Mignon cast on the mythical land where she was born. I asked, I would sing Mignon's song. Do you know that land? My song was richer in subject, richer also in tears, which streamed down from my eyes. There, my sweetheart, there it is that I want you to take me. Each time I depart from our unique birthplace, each time I find it more wonderful. It's blue, the color of love, of poetry. It's blue, the color of the eyes of the goddesses. It's blue, the color of the surface of the stars close to God. It's blue, the ascending smoke of the incense. It's blue, color of the threads of the silver crowns of the mountain brides. It's blue, color of the flower, vergiss mij nicht, forget me not. It's blue, color of stockings. Well, where is blue more blue than here? Oh, what is more blue than the Bosporus? And I would sing, there, my sweetheart, there it is that I want you to take me. When I left Byzantium for the first time, my heart sank. Deluges descended from my eyes. When I passed by Moda's Campo, I fainted. Of all the beautiful places in our city, I cherished Moda Berni most. And that because in the evening sunsets, wonderful panoramas would spread out before my eyes. And at night, on the lighthouse, the exquisite fainting fits of light. And because the waves had persuaded me there with the sound of their mysterious murmuring tongue, that they would easily transport me into the bosom of Nirvana. Still, how irresistible was the attraction of its blue, when from the blue Bosporus I went away. Far from the Bosporus, not for Moda and its dark dictations I wept, but for the Bosporus itself. There, my sweetheart, there it is that I want you to take me. People laugh and write and sing from one end of the world to the other, beautiful is the Bosporus. Sometimes I myself, susceptible to such beauty, often I would also say to myself, beautiful is the Bosporus, but I thought that the world would have yet many, many other Bosporuses. When some people would leave Constantinople, the world to all appearances would become just so much more beautiful. When I left Constantinople, when I saw other blue waters, other white dwellings, other lands and other skies, I exclaimed with a sigh, there, my sweetheart, there it is that I want you to take me. You come from the Mediterranean, you return, the ship has passed between the archipelago and the Princess Islands. Green boats also those islands are, always flowing gently and always wafting a scent. The boat has arrived at San Stefano. Oh, marvelous, the shapes of Byzantium in the night. On your right is the Asian side, on your left the European. A lighthouse on each of the sides. One eye holds Europe, one eye Asia. Two eyes form one face, one countenance. Two worlds will be one soul, one body. And heaven and earth will be united. From the Black Sea dawn flows, mingles with the darkness of the night. From the Milky Way light flows, mingles with the marble of the palaces and the waving of the lighthouses. Neither by the light nor by the darkness is the blue of the Bosporus conquered. On the contrary, an incomparable harmony of color ensues. And one asks oneself, is this unique city more beautiful at night or by day? The marble siren between Saraburni and Chrysopolis of all that beauty and splendor captivates you like a dreamlike comparison, and you take wing. That is the place where a mixture of two streams, of two seas embrace each other in a duel of love. Is it a dream or reality, my God? Find a place in Europe that engenders so much inspiring aesthetic pleasure. Oh, a pleasure, undoubtedly a pleasure it is to sail on the Mediterranean. There the beauty of nature is doubled by the beauty of history. You will say hello to Athens, where there are so many ancient, wonderful monuments of art. But the civilization that had come from Athens to Rome has come from the south to Athens following the laws of longitude. Well, you will be filled with even greater piety when the steamer takes south from Piraeus. There is the Nile sanctuary, its source unknown and boundless in its yield, on the banks of which the first empire was founded, and the first monuments of architecture stand. And science, the foundation of the science of computation is located there. And there, before everywhere else, a woman was teacher and taught the higher sciences, the greatly renowned Hypatia. The ship turns to the promontory, the shining, cradling city advances towards the west. And there, on those banks, is the fixed, eternal city, the one that became the heiress of Athens' civilization, just as so many cities inherited from her the whole of Europe. Very beautiful indeed is that capital city, built on hills, Rome, like Byzantium. But the divider of two worlds, the center point of two civilizations, is our city. On the whole globe, the Bosporus is unique. The more you recede from her shores, the more you will sigh and supplicate from the depths. There, my sweetheart, there it is that I want you to take me. There, that is to say here, in our illustrious city, there is sea and rivulet and little lake and endless heights from which sides gold and emerald flow down. Density of forest and density of waves. Joy and feasting on the waves and in the forests, of white and dark birds of the sea and the dry land. On the walls of the palaces, microscopic palaces are built. You will walk under their wings and over gold and silver dust, sometimes over the Bosporus, sometimes over the Golden Horn. From one bank to the other a bridge is built, oscillating, changeable in form. wavering, streaming light, streaming harmony. How often have I passed under those winged, melodious bridges? Has a more beautifully shaped little boat than a kayak been invented? The residences and the palaces on the shores of the Bosporus are swans with their wings tucked in, you would think, who rest on the dry land in majestic tranquility, leaving the water to the bathers and the stream flies, and the countless ships, large and small, that navigate from shore to shore, or else along the shore, or again halfway from the shore. The commanding pool of our august city is not at all an aspiration to an upward flight. The seashore is narrow, therefore you go upward, and even the stones have a swiftness, the minarets and the belfries, the lighthouses and the towers. In a gold-rimmed, azure bed, a wonderful woman of miraculous beauty, covered by a green garment which stretches towards heaven countless white wings, offers blue to the heavens and receives blue from heaven. O my Bosporus, when they send your beloved away from you, with what intensity will even your nerves moan? There, my sweetheart, there it is, I want you to take me. This poetic sigh brings us to the final words of this presentation, in which I attempted to give the beginning of an idea about Eghia Demirjibashian's hope and despair, of the value of his rich contribution to Armenian and thereby to world literature, and above all, to invite you to engage with his work as readers, as students, as fellow human beings. Thank you for your patience.